Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here and braving the traffic in support of open and structured data. My name is Jonathan Elliott. I'm the COO of Research Data Group and RDG Filings. You really don't want to hear me talk as much as you want to hear this man to my left talk, so I will be quick. Research Data Group provides compliance services and software tools to public companies to help them communicate with investors and comply with regulations with greater ease. And we've been in this industry for nearly 30 years. We're excited to see all the changes that have taken place recently. Our country is finally pushing forward with real changes to help our system be more effective and efficient. Those words do not normally correspond with government, but we are finally making the move in the right direction. The single most important change in the past 10 years has been the passing of the Data Act. And we are very, very enthusiastic and an executive member of the Data Transparency Coalition because we understand that opening up government data can help everyone in the country. Not just idealistically, but it is going to be, in a very practical sense, the organization and linking of information that will help individual citizens, politicians, investors, institutions, and municipalities make better decisions in almost every aspect of what they do. The Data Act is the first open data law, and many people have a hard time trying to understand just how large an undertaking the transformation from static documents to structured and searchable data is. Our speaker for this panel is Representative Darrell Issa. He is the champion of the Data Act and understands what lies ahead. He knows that successful implementation of the Data Act cannot be achieved by one team, one person, or one government agency. It requires a concerted effort from so many agencies and individuals. He also knows that there is more to be done and more leadership required to truly transform the way our government reports its information, and he's going to touch on the next steps here today. Without further ado, Representative Darrell Issa.
Well, with that kind of an introduction, I should just take the applause and leave. First of all, thank you very much. The one name that you didn't mention, that without partners on the Hill, things don't happen. And my partner in the Data Act and the Senate side was Senator Warner. And I think it's extremely important to understand he was the one that went to Harry Reid, then Majority Leader, and demanded that the bill be moved. And although Senator Reid insisted that it be a Senate bill, ultimately, it's the Senate, you have to expect that. But ultimately, we made law together. And the Data Act is just, as it was said, it's a major piece of legislation, but it's just a start. You can write legislation, but unless you oversee it and implement it, and you're just diligent day after day, it'll be meaningless. The fact is, today, there are many CIOs who still are, in fact, not competent, nor do they have the financial controls, the budget controls of their projects. Another major stumbling block. It doesn't mean there hasn't been a law passed. It means that we, in fact, have to stay on top of that, and we have partners in that effort. I think most congressmen have one thing that they can do very, very well, and that is they can talk about their next piece of legislation. So I want to get that out of the way so there not be any mystery. The Financial Transparency Act, obviously law, but the next steps are to insist that we make all data in government just as good and just as available. And some of it's hard. Just before I was coming up, they started saying, well, what happens if you're taking a picture of a pothole? How do you make a picture of a pothole machine searchable? Well, if you're using a camera that's modern, you are going to have the GPS location. You are going to have the time and date. You are going to have rich metadata that, if not lost, does make that unique location for that unique picture at that unique time extremely valuable and searchable. It may not tell you why it was taken. It may not tell you whether it's been fixed, but at least it's a start. I want to mention one thing that I have a passion for, and that's modernizing FOIA. Because the Data Act is a standard that helps a tool. And the Freedom of Information Act is today, in my opinion, a great success that is a fraction of what it was intended to be and it could be. Every day, countless individuals, companies, news organizations, and law firms try to receive information under FOIA. The first thing that happens is it goes to a human being who begins a search process, who then begins looking through the data in order to redact information that's not going to be given. Literally a human nightmare to try to do. Under the Data Act, we envision that metadata will be so easily searched that when you're looking for it, you won't even have to ask for a FOIA, because the vast majority of information that today is being asked for in FOIA will already be available online with appropriate personal identifiable information and other fields that have been predetermined as at least not available openly being removed. So FOIA will be limited to, I looked at the data indicates something more, and I believe I have a right to some portion of what is redacted. But knowing what you're asking for and cutting down the number of FOIA requests dramatically, because the vast majority of what you want is already there, available, online, searchable, and to be developed, is a good start to making government open and transparent. I think one of the most important things I can do at my age is to tell the young people in the room how we got here and why we shouldn't be here, but why it was logical somehow to get here. Nearly 40 years ago, actually 40 years ago plus, I ran my first computer program. Well, actually I ran part of it until the card popped up showing me that I had a flaw in my program. Yeah, giggle in the back. You haven't actually held a stack of cards with 3 failures in it, only one of which you get shown, because you have to run it again with that corrected before you find the next mistake, line by line by line. In those days, we all understood that each card was simply more or less a 0 and a 1, that everything was purely data, and we were turning it into something. Over the next few years, we turned computer programs into devices that could be run for all their errors. You could bypass an error and go on and find the next one. We also began printing out massive amount of ASCII characters on printers. Absolutely useless information unless you read it. But behind that, if you had an index, you could find out anything you wanted to find out about the data you were building. At that moment, whether it was a DEC or a Digital Corporation for those who came after it, or an IBM or an HP or a myriad of other companies, many of whom NCR and so on are not here today, had we said, oh, we have the beginnings of metadata. We have what we index. Well, let's store in those characters the index. We would have been fine, but we didn't do it. What we did was we continued along with proprietary indexing, proprietary calls, little characters that were embedded with no standard. And many organizations over the next many decades built standard after standard after standard that were, well, you could have as many standards as you want, and everyone picked a different one. Today, we know that we can build standards that everyone can use or export to or make available and still maintain their proprietary calls. That's the future that is now with us. So one of the questions is, how do we get from a law to implementation? And there are really 3 components to it. One component very, very clearly is public demand. The public has to look at the benefits they get from open data. All of us who know and can know where our airplane flight is coming in, or even while you're on the airplane, find out exactly where you are benefiting from data that's been made open for the application industry. All of us who have and we all have an app, come on, everyone in the room has a weather app somewhere, okay, and you only use it when you're worried, but it is there all the time. Again, data made open. But imagine If all the spending of government to all the vendors was made open and available as appropriate for non-classified work, imagine how quickly we could find out that the government, through no fault of its own, pays 10 different prices for the same product, and in fact may buy once from the company that manufactures it, once from a distributor, and several times from retailers, and not even be aware that the way they went out for contracts they did that. Imagine how much savings we could have. But let's also imagine a world in which government stops, and I said there were three parts. Government stops making that progress and goes back. What do we do about it? Is it natural for vendors to say, yeah, the Data Act's great, but it might hurt my particular revenue stream downstream, so I'm not going to do it? Unless the executive branch says, no, we really mean it. We're not looking for open software, but we are looking for open data, and we insist on it. And imagine as government goes from one program, one person, one time to another, that Congress simply closes their eyes and says, oh, we passed that law, we're good. I think you can quickly imagine that if Congress takes its eyes off of the oversight, then the weeks, the months, the years, and the decades will go by, and we will still have legacy programs and post-legacy programs and post-legacy programs, such as those programs from the 60s that the IRS claims they're still using with computers that are pretty well from the 60s. We can still have that, and we can pay a huge price for it. Under the Data Act, the Office of Management and Budget has huge responsibility. Treasury has a huge opportunity. But when I said that it's the public, the executive branch, and Congress that have the primary responsibility, I should have said it's the public that must demand. It's the public must continue to demand. It's the public that must ask why not. Because the only way to get the executive branch to stay on it is for it to be important in a political sense. The only way for Congress to stay on it is for it to be meaningful with organizations like this that are dedicated to it. And so I charge all of you, we passed a law. I intend for the rest of my career to stay on top of it to the best of my ability every day and to work with others. But you have an opportunity, and many members of the coalition are doing it right now. Every time you build an app or try to build an app to take advantage of data that's being made available, you market to the public the benefit of rich data sets, and your frustrations need to be communicated in three ways. To the executive branch, and there are major representatives here today, to your Congress, one might say I'm here today, and that was a good line. I'm glad somebody liked that. I'm the Congress for today. And lastly, you have to communicate it to the public. Do not go quietly into it's going to happen next week, next month, next year. It's not in the budget this year. If you have a success, market it to public and tell them it's because of open data. And if you're being thwarted or delayed, make sure you go just as public with it. Because ultimately, somewhere, there's some bureaucrat, bless their hearts. I always say bless their hearts when I don't mean it. And they are just a matter of weeks or months or maybe years from retirement, but they just don't want to have that challenge. Well, the people that work for them and come afterwards want it. And so for all the young, energetic government workers who want to be thought of as the leading edge of good technology, make sure you go public if there's somebody there who is looking and saying, that'll happen on the next person's watch because I only have 3 years left to retirement, and that's too much hassle. Now, you notice I didn't mention government contractors. I didn't do so because my assumption is that contractors do what is important and what is put into the bids. So one of the areas that I'm working with other members of Congress is to ensure that Congress begins pushing the executive branch to make sure that it's in the bid and that there's a benefit in the bid. No subcontractor or contractor for the government or government agency directly should ever be working with data, modernizing a program, and not have part of their incentive to take us from where we've been to where we know we have to be. And that's going to be a monumental change. On time, on budget, of course, is important. On time, on budget, and saving the American people countless billions of dollars over the next decades by opening up data, that's got to be in the bid. You won't see it the day the software is delivered, but you will see it for a generation to come. Just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. In closing, we're just starting. In closing, this is the opening round for open data. There are companies that will take advantage of it and make fortunes. There are nonprofits who will take advantage of it and embarrass people in the administration, not just this one, but the next one and the one after. And if I have my way, the same level of open data will be both great for the public and questionable for members of Congress as data gets opened in all the branches. So I want to just close by saying this is a start. I'm delighted that you're here, that there is, in fact, a coalition that dedicates itself to the same thing that Senator Warner and I were honored to be able to start. So the conference is a delight to attend. I look forward to next year having a list of accomplishments, because I believe that this presidency, which was promised to be the most open and transparent, does have an opportunity to show that it can open up government at the areas that are least understood and least transparent, and do it before the lights go off for this administration. And I think they will. I think they've set a course. I think they've appointed good people. Now the question is, will we hold them to a timeline that's the same as the timeline of the president? Because if any timeline is offered to you this year, and it's one day after January 20th, 2017, then it's not a timeline, it's a dream. We don't need dreams, we don't need promises. We need what will you deliver before January 20th, 2017. Thank you very much for all being here.
Take some questions from the audience. I have a couple of questions here as well. I'll just start.
Well, we'll take yours last. Who else has a question?
Thank you. No, go ahead. One of the requirements of the Data Act is that they have to get all of their, not only what they're reporting, but recipients have to report this information. Grant recipients have to report it back. What do you see as the biggest obstacle in achieving that, in getting the grant recipients to report?
That's a great question, and the reason it's such a great question is grant recipients were the obstacle to this bill passing when it passed out of the House on a fully bipartisan basis and sat for 2 years. There are two reasons that there's an obstacle. One, I can understand. You're a university professor, you're getting a couple of $1 million every so many years, and you're used to loosely living up to the grant, but perhaps hiring an administrative assistant here or there that only loosely work on the program. The Data Act is intended to really follow the money and to see whether it is auditable as being spent appropriately to whatever the grant was for. And we think that's important, and we think that those who shy away from it often do so because it's nice to get a pot of money, and I don't want to say laws were broken or anything else, but the commingling and the moving around of grant money has gone on at universities since I was since the NCR 500 and me in university. So that's one challenge. The other challenge is that we in government, we that write grants, we that take applications, until the administration realizes that no one should have to enter data twice, that every entity, every unique entity should have a number. And once it has a number, its personally identifiable information, its single database should be there, so that just like most of us when we log in, we expect to log in, and it doesn't matter whether it's the cloud with Google or our local device. We want to log in, we want it to say, "Hi, Daryl," and we want it to have all kinds of information already there, so we don't have to enter it twice. And if you assume that you're, for example, the University of California, and information is automatically populated. It's not asking you endlessly to give it essentially the same information, but at the most asking you to fact check what comes up. Then you see a reason for this information delivered this way to be valuable. That is government's responsibility. Live up to the dream that you shouldn't have to enter again and again and again, even if it's a different agency, the exact same information, and allow that information to be valuable to the university that's overseeing, in the case of the University of California, thousands of grants, because we think that's a value to the grant recipient that they don't have today, which is to oversee and organize its grants in an easy way from a federal database. So, one, we can't do anything about except insist compliance. Two, we can be part of making it better for the grant recipients, so they're more they're more incentivized to support this.
Thank you. You also talked. Oh, Hudson's waving at me. He's got an important question. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Marianne Bellotti. I'm the CTO of a company called Xversion, and full disclosure, I'm a software developer. So,
is that a confession or what?
Yes,
you know,
it is.
if you told me you were a lawyer, that would be a confession.
Well, one of the problems that we're seeing kind of like developing on the edge of the open data movement is that often the people who are releasing the data don't really understand what a personal identification sort of piece of data actually looks like. So they pick on the obvious things like name, social security number, phone number, address, but there are a lot of like non-obvious things that, especially as more and more data is released from more and more sources, people like me can take multiple data sets and sort of run them together and figure out like who's who in the data set. You have things like things being hashed incorrectly, which was a problem the city of New York had earlier this year. So my question for you is, because my biggest fear as an open data advocate is this is going to create a political backlash at some point. What policies are being put in place by the law to help these agencies sort of like come up and educate themselves technically so that they're not releasing data that's ultimately going to bite them in the ass later on?
Ass is a technical term, right? No, you've hit on one of the great challenges of metadata that's not properly defined. The federal government has an endless amount of history of how we define what a name is, what a social security number is, and so on. But programs have been written without, if you will, compliant metadata identifiers, and that has to happen. And that is a matter of going into it and saying, here is the federal standard for all of this. Can our data be searched based on it? Because the last thing you want to do is deal with it as though you had 5 spreadsheets written by 5 different people who named the top of every cell a different name with a different width, with a different whatever. You don't want that, and you don't need that, and you shouldn't have it. The fact is that government agencies need to put their data in a format where there's a standard comparison. Having said that, your challenge as a software developer is, in the current world, yes, you need to be able to, and the post office happens to have a great program that almost works. Now come on, if you take your data sets because you've entered, name, address, zip code and so on, you've named it as well as you can. The post office, and you give them the data, they have a wonderful program that actually corrects almost everything. It will change your abbreviation for avenue or street to make it compliant. It, of course, will add the zip plus. And a lot of the fuzzy logic that it takes is pretty amazing to take really bad typos in data entry for names, addresses, and the like for postal and make it right. Software for the interim is going to have to do a lot of that with government data. You're going to, for the short term, be getting a lot of data that you're exactly right. Somebody embedded the name a second or a third time without a field indicator, and it's going to take some cleanup in logic. That's one of the opportunities, if you will, for software companies, particularly if they're working with the federal government on Data Act compliance, is to scrub the existing data, apply appropriate identifiable metadata so it doesn't have to be further scrubbed in the future. And I believe that, although there'll have to be funding from Congress, that those earmarks, if you will, those actions to get data so that you're not as, you sounded a little like a lawyer, you said in fear of litigation, but you shouldn't be in fear of litigation because the government does need to scrub and clean up their data so that doesn't happen. And if the post office can be part of the solution in the case of the data that I had in Outlook, the fact is that you and companies like you shouldn't have to worry about that data being reasonably scrubbed. Hudson, who else have you picked as a shill?
Hudson, we need a microphone down front here.
No, I think we've got, there we go.
Thank you, Justin.
Hi, I'm Jeff Myers with REI Systems, and I first want to say I think the Data Act is fantastic. It provides a huge amount of valuable data. But I think of a particular use case. I'd like to be able to look across the federal government and say, where is all the spending on the same program? Where's all the spending on the same activity, even if it happens in different agencies? Where is all the spending on the same mission? And not just because I care about those spending, but because I want to figure out where there's either duplication or a need to coordinate. And so my question is, will you, or is there an interest or a commitment to taking the Data Act further and saying, for example, right now agencies are required to identify the program, but one agency might say, it's water quality audits, and another might say it's water quality safety, and another might say it's, water quality research. Will there be an opportunity to take the Data Act further to further use cases like the ones I've described?
And the answer is yes, and if we get cooperation from the administration, we shouldn't need a new law. The Office of Management Budget, in setting, if you will, or requiring that all the agencies set a common standard, can do a lot of this. Years ago, I had a simple task. Everything's simple until you get the bill for it. All I wanted to know was how many jet aircraft and prop, but mostly jet, does the government own? What models are they? How long have they been around? And who controls them? And this happened to be shortly after 9/11, so I was a very junior member. And so they kind of laughed at me. Well, as the years went on, I kept re-asking it. And it's amazing, even the Department of Defense has a whole joint group with multiple officers trying to figure out where all their aircraft are and who's controlling them and what they do. That's a pretty simple thing. I mean, you spend a few $1 million each. There's only, so many, let's call it 1,000 non-fighter aircraft. It shouldn't be that hard to figure it out. I can tell you, if you wanted that information today, it would cost the government a fortune to get it to you, because the Coast Guard has aircraft and this group has one and so on. You're exactly right. Interoperable standards where if it's the same thing, it's named the same way. If it's a similar thing, it has a number that is identifiable as similar. So you can not only find exact matches, but even when there is a characteristic different, there is a unique metadata identifier. And that's really what we're getting to, is a standard setting for what you call something if it's identical, and what you call something when there's a difference. And OMB has a responsibility to build an, if you will, interagency cooperation to get that. Candidly, DOD hasn't gotten there yet, and we're hoping that they'll be among the first, because if I've got a Caterpillar D9 tractor in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, and I need a part, and that part is somewhere in the world under some agency, the last thing in the world I want is to have that asset down while somebody's waiting to buy something we already own, and the other one is heading to property disposal. But that happens today, and it costs us billions. Hudson, who else? Anyone? If you run out of questions, I have a second speech.
So my name is Tony DePue. I'm a consultant with Deloitte. And I've heard you talk a little bit about the Data Act supporting this concept of establishing a common language. I think it's a very powerful concept, and I wanted to get your perspective on how that might impact Congress's ability to support its function in its capacity to represent people.
Okay, I'm gonna answer the question as I interpret it. I think I heard you say that, you know, what will happen if the Data Act is fully implemented to where all data can be made meaningful by a common program searching multiple databases, if you will, a little like Google going out to every newspaper and seeing what they all wrote about their congressman. The questions that the American people have on whether their money is well spent, whether they're properly represented, whether the waiting time at a particular Veterans Administration center is based on an actual shortfall of doctors or, in fact, an inefficiency within the hospital. Questions like that, in a democracy, our republic is a representative democracy, but the ability of every individual to know more before they ask a question of their congressman, or for their congressman or woman to be able to get the information directly rather than months or years later, can have a dramatic effect. I would love nothing more than for my constituents who are waiting for VA service to know what the wait times are at every hospital, know what the ratios are between the number of doctors and the amount of care, and be able to say, you know, my hospital in Brunswick, Ohio, is underperforming, and as a result, I'm waiting longer and not getting care. What's wrong? That kind of a question is so much more powerful than I'm waiting, what can you do for me? And we try to get them into the hospital faster. So I see it as empowering to members. I do see it as producing a lot more constituent requests, but those will be very targeted requests because a lot of the information will already be either gleaned by the constituent or easily gotten by a caseworker at a computer screen rather than waiting for weeks or months from an answer from an agency. So I see that as part of it, but much of this will only happen if the software industry supporting this open data provide those tools. I have no illusions that, you know, Lena Wright, who is one of my caseworkers in California, there's no way that she's going to develop the program to go search those databases, but that program, I believe, will be developed and made available if and only if the data is searchable. And whether it's an open Google standard or a Lockheed contract, I don't care in a way right now. I just want it available to my caseworker and 534 other caseworkers.
Hi, my name is Darla Marburger, and I'm with Teradata.
You're with what?
Teradata.
Yes.
And one of the things that, whenever you're implementing law, of course, a lot of the heavy lifting happens at the agency level. And as we talk with agencies, a lot of them have different sentiments about the implementation of the Data Act itself, particularly being able to get value via analysis and analytics. I've worked with data from USA Spending, and it currently is a testament to the need for standards in the Data Act. My question for you is, do agencies have the capacity to fully implement the Act? And the reason I ask that is because some of them, in casual conversation I hear, not conversations I've had myself, that some of them believe they don't have access to some of the data to be compliant with the Act. And so what would you say about that capacity issue?
Okay, and I apologize. The agency you work with, I missed hearing that.
I've worked for agencies before, but I don't currently work for one.
Oh, okay.
I work for Teradata.
Okay. Well, no, but I mean, you said some agencies didn't think they had the ability. I just wondered if you wanted to name one. You know, it's this old habit from my days at the dais. The answer to a question like that, quite frankly, is a leadership question from the White House through OMB. I agree that people at a given level may either think they don't have the ability or may validly not have the ability. And that's the reason that if the office management budget leads on behalf of the president, what they're going to very clearly do is say, we need a plan from every agency. How will you fully comply? What are your roadblocks? What is your funding estimate? What are your short-term, and it should be short-term, easy, low-hanging fruit? In other words, what portion of your data is already in a format that can be easily made available? What portion of your data isn't? What guidance do you need for setting metadata standards? All those questions, some of them have been asked by OMB, and I don't want to shortcount the administration's willingness to do some of this. But you're right about one thing. It is typical for an agency to say, oh, another mandate from Congress. It's unfunded because in their mind, that whatever money they got wasn't for that. And I don't expect movement unless this process goes forward where agencies are directed to produce plans. They're given guidance. And in my estimation, when you look at the Security Exchange Commission, who in many ways is head of it, but in many ways is, I can't say recalcitrant. I can never pronounce that word that says that they just don't want to do it. But, you know, quite frankly, some of the agencies, the FDIC and others, are actually very far along toward having their data in the right format and very far along toward not providing it in some cases. So this is where the president's leadership is important. You need to both shed light on the agencies that are ready to go, have a lot of it, allow them to lead in the best practices determination and helping other agencies understand what they need to do. And at the same time, you need to say, and the law as written has to be implemented, and if you think we need to change something, let me know, because that's why we have thousands of people who are called legislative, presidential legislative appointees. I mean, there's an army of people appointed by the president that are supposed to be working on legislative challenges, and we will meet with them at any time if they say they need a follow-on to the Data Act. Chairman Chaffetz will meet with them at any time if they need a follow-on. But until they tell us what they don't have and what they need, my assumption is that it's a lack of leadership. And when you hear that from an agency, the only question I'd ask you to say is, what have you done to find out what your capabilities are, what they're not, and how you're going to get from here to there? Because you've been told where you have to end up. Do you already know where you are? Have you done an assessment of where you are? Or do you just say, we can't do it? I would propose to all of you that if an agency can type a few keys, and most can, at some level and get a piece of information in a proper format where they know what the personally identifiable information are, they know what the available information are, and when they get done with their system building that index and delivering them either on a screen or on a piece of paper, the 25 entities that match all in nice rows, and they export it to Excel. If you can do that in an agency, then you already have everything except metadata that is assigned to those fields that makes it interoperable. You already are mostly there. And that's where I think people misunderstand. Within an agency, within a particular program, almost everybody has everything they need. The only thing they don't have is interoperable identifiers embedded. And if every agency were to publish their, if you will, their keys, and then you compare their keys for what it means to another agency's keys for what it means, you could build a table for bringing them all together. Now, we do that every time we ask for a report that comes from multiple agencies. If we do it one time and say, build the table, and now everyone has to understand that you've got to go back to your program and add another number, which is the common number that we're going to use for that throughout government. Now you never have to do it again. That's what the magic, if you will, of implementing the Data Act is, that you go and you look at those ambiguities, you compare them, you fix them, and now you don't have to spend $100,000 every time government, or Congress in this case, or some agency asks for a report. because the common unique number for a common unique event is simply a matter of saying to agencies, I know you all made up numbers. Now we're not going to make up numbers anymore. We're going to assign a common number. And you're right. At the local level, it can't be done. But with leadership, the local level can prepare the information for the interagency process to do its job. And I saw some head shaking, so I might have been right on that one part of technology. You know, anyone that comes in and talks about their beginning with NCR 500s and then DEC 10s and PDP 1145s loses the audience immediately, except for the grayest of the gray. But sadly, my computer time began in the 70s and has gone till today with me looking at everything based on, well, we couldn't do it with you know, a few bits of data and these old processors, but we imagined we could do it then. And now we can do it if we just take the time to imagine it, and that's why I'm so excited. Yes, ma'am. They should have left the microphone down there. The front row is always the cheap seats. They ask really great questions, but they're shy. Up front is where you get the great questions. Well, there's your mic.
Helena.
I hope I live up to that. I'm Helena Sims, and I work for the Association of Government Accountants. And this question probably won't surprise you, considering who I work for, but I'm curious in terms of the accuracy of data. All the analytics don't really work if the data is not accurate to begin with. One of the things that some of our members have been kicking around is the idea of a management certification, so that when management submits data into a system, the manager has to sign a statement saying, to the best of his knowledge or her knowledge, the information is correct. Do you think that is a logical approach? If not, what's a good approach to making data more accurate?
Well, I like yours.
Good.
As someone who headed a company as a CEO, and we took the company public as a board member, I'm acutely aware that I had to increase the pay of my CFO when he and the CEO both had to sign the audited financial statements. It is amazing that we passed, I guess it was Sarbanes-Oxley, and required both the CFO and the CEO to sign. And this is a sign for which you can go to jail, for which your personal accumulation of treasure can be taken away if you're false. And it makes an assumption of a reasonable due diligence of knowing that those facts are correct. Not just, I don't know they're flawed, but in fact, I've taken the due diligence to do so. That standard is a perfectly reasonable standard for the equivalent in government. Now, the question is equivalent in government the CEO equivalent, or is it the chief information officer, the CTO? I think that's something that government has to work out. But whoever that agency person is needs to control budget, personnel, and access sufficient to make that certification. Now, we do that in a number of programs. Famously, the people who decided who signed for the healthcare.gov website going live, they did bounce it around, and all the smart people refused. So there were several asked, and only the fool signed it. And by that time, we were into somebody who didn't know. So I think the lesson from, and there are two programs that we learn lessons from in this act. One is healthcare.gov. This was an example where the people who knew better were sidelined or gone around, and it became sort of a, well, we've got to do it. It's the president's most important thing, and so it's got to go live, rather than, no, it's got to work when it goes up, or it's going to embarrass the president, and he didn't write the code, it's not his fault, and yet it's going to be a tremendous embarrassment. So that's why you have to determine, and your point's good, we have to determine at the start who is going to sign it. And that person has to be in a position where throughout the entire process, they have sufficient transparency, so when it comes time to sign it, they don't go, hell, I'm not signing that, I didn't do it. Or I'm signing it, but of course I don't know if it worked or not. That has to be the case. And so your point is correct, it's the right way to do it. And I think it's certainly the CIO has a role in it, and likely would be one of the people that would have to be a signator. The other point, and you said data accuracy and so on, and I think I want to make a point. Years ago now, when we did, Congress did the Stimulus Act, and we appointed a special board, and you know, the poor chairman comes right out of being one of the most popular IGs, and we tell him to show us where the money's being spent. And of course, it was a disaster. For political purposes, the administration wanted to show how much money was going into every congressional districts. And I remember in the first weeks, the press had a heyday because there were congressional districts greater in California, I think had a 58th. And there was probably a 35th or whatever, a 40th in New York. There were numbers that corresponded with nothing. And it was wonderful. And it was wonderful because the public saw it, said this is absurd, and it got corrected. And so working with Gene and the other people involved, what we had a system that, because of its transparency, because the data was open and available, for all the flaws, they quickly got correct. Most of them got corrected because we had 300 million people who had a vested interest in looking at it and sometimes mocking it. I would call that the greatest success you have because it could be fixed, because it was built to be open and transparent and to search for data in a way that rooted out a lot of fraud in an $800 billion quickly cobbled together program. So the stimulus is, I may not have liked it, I didn't vote for it, but at least we knew where the money was spent, and the software supporting it turned out to be a good basis for us demanding all of government do it, and hence the Data Act.
We have one more question from the back.
Okay, you got to, that last question was so cool that I just hope you can live up to it.
I really hope so. My name is Siobhan Green, and I'm the co-founder of a women-owned IT firm. We focus on open data in international development.
Bless you.
And do a lot of work with USAID and foreign assistance generally. So my question for you is, how do you see the Data Act and the International Aid Transparency Initiative and other open data working on an international stage, and what can the U.S. government do to help encourage many partners who are less than transparent to change their minds?
Okay, well, as a member of Foreign Affairs, I said bless you for a reason. I'll tell you how big the problem is, and then give you a partial solution. In the early August, I was in Nigeria. I was in Lagos and Abuja. Now, only a few weeks before I was there, the new president had come to the White House, and Treasury had briefed the president on the fact that his Minister of Energy, who the previous president had as a mistress, had stolen $500 million essentially every month for more than 5 years. Yeah, the arithmetic of $500 million a month every month for years is pretty amazing. And a great deal of it is in real estate and other assets in the United States. And so the Department of Treasury was kind of saying to the new president, if you'll charge her with the crime, we can freeze the assets and get your government back this large amount of money. She hasn't been charged. They can't charge her because they're stealing just as much. The whole game in Nigeria is so corrupt that everyone at every level steals. They actually back up whole steamers just with clandestine pipelines to take the oil in vast amounts. And if you're the U.S. oil company and you say anything, then you'll get shut down. So you just produce your oil and you don't worry about how many holes there are in the pipeline. That level of corruption in Nigeria begs the question of how do we account for the $500 million that we give them in aid every year because, well, they're stealing and building palaces around the world, including the United States. Their people are suffering, particularly in the northeast, where Boko Haram is kidnapping girls and ransoming and so on. The answer is some problems are so tough you can't fix them. On the other hand, if we go to, for example, the Palestinian territories, where we have a major aid program going on for years, where you can actually look and see their entire government spending online. They did away with cash payments. They began trying to get rid of ghost employees about 10 years ago under, I guess, Salam Fayyad. The fact is, you do the best you can with the country you have. Now, the Department of State has to decide, do we give $500 million to a rich country that's stealing from itself or not? I would say that in Nigeria, that decision is perhaps we're giving money to a hopeless situation in which, as much as we'd like to help the people, it's clear that the government has the ability to do it if they'll just have the will to do it. In the case of other areas where the government says, I need the help, then you make the standards for the government to make sure, or allow you to make sure, that those NGOs are vetted and accountable, and that those NGOs are not being held up by government agencies. In Nigeria, I'd hate to be an NGO trying to deliver services knowing that there's a lot of it being siphoned off by thugs along the way. But in many countries we do business with and help, that's not the case. So the answer is the Data Act can certainly help you see the performance of NGOs, how much money in, how much real service out. It can follow some of the money in the banking system in most countries. So we can do a lot to inform the Department of State. I don't know that we can make that decision about what do we do in Afghanistan or in, obviously, I used Nigeria as a whipping boy, but in sub-Saharan Africa, because every one of those countries is a different challenge. And good data is only as good as the first dollar spent and then the NGO for accountability. What I will say is, and you deal with this, the vast majority of NGOs are honest, and the ones that aren't honest, the honest ones are telling you loud and clear that they're stealing. So a lot of it at USAID, and I work this a lot in both my old committee and in Foreign Affairs, a lot of it is a matter of USAID listening. When there's a real accusation by one NGO or many NGOs that they're getting ripped off by another, it's a management decision. If you give the Inspector General direct access to the data as it is, in most cases, they can find it and they can disqualify those NGOs, and that means more money arrives where it's supposed to be. So again, I can sell the Data Act for what it can do, but it's only going to be as good as the transparency to the public who insist on their money being well spent, or to the agencies who now have better transparency making good management decisions. And I don't want to go any further on the Department of State because I've stayed as high as I can on that particular issue. Are you going to, what's your closing question is, can I leave now?
There's a need to network. We have a networking break, and we have run a little bit over. Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Congressman.